Welcome to You Are From God, where we open the Bible and learn to see the image of God in ourselves and the people around us. I'm Scott Taylor.
And I'm Tyler Hall. Thanks for joining us today. Thank you for joining us for another episode of You Are From God. I'm here with Scott, and today we're excited to start another new short series on the program. For the next few episodes, we're going to be talking about feelings. And so as we think about the image of God in ourselves, recognizing that we are made in the image of God, Scott, one of the important things that I think we can pendulum swing, as we call it, go too far in one direction or too far in the other, is recognizing that our feelings are designed and given to us by God. He's made us to experience these feelings, but the big question is always what we do with them, how we manage those feelings, and how we channel them, what it leads into action and how we respond to those feelings. And so today we're going to start by looking at a feeling that the scriptures mention a lot, and that feeling is fear. Fear is very simply just this uneasiness or the anticipation that something bad is going to happen. And that can be something as simple as you get a bad grade on a test to, the worst, you're fearful for your life. And so we have this wide range of what we can fear about. And as we talked about, the fear aspect is a feeling that God gives to us. Now, He gives us that fear so we can obviously stay safe and preserve our lives in situations, and not just physically, but also understand spiritually. There's an aspect of fear that plays into us understanding the risk of not coming to God through His Son, Jesus Christ. But there's also this important piece to understand, Scott, that fear can also completely immobilize us when it comes to doing the things that we are called to do. We are truly called to live fearless lives in the regard of trusting in the Lord, and that's where we really want to spend our time today. I think there's no better place to go for this, though, Scott, than 2 Timothy chapter 1 and verse 7. Paul simply states here, as he talks to Timothy, God gave us a spirit not of fear, but of power and love and self-control. So for the episode today, we want to break down those three. If God didn't give us a spirit of fear, He gave us the spirit of power and love and self-control. We want to look at each of those. How does power, love, and self-control help us manage our fear and handle our fear appropriately? So the first one of those that we want to look at, Scott, is power.
I mean, you think about no better example of this, at least I don't, than Joshua. Joshua, the first chapter, a few times God is going to tell him, be strong and courageous, and he'll make that point time and time again. And you just imagine the situation that Joshua is in and the concern. This is really the beginning of the time that he doesn't have Moses there. And just imagine the responsibility and the magnitude of what he's going to have to do. And God says, look, don't worry about those things. I'm with you, as he goes on and says. And then so in Joshua, the first chapter in verse 9, as an example, he says, have I not commanded you, be strong and courageous, do not tremble or be dismayed, for the Lord your God is with you wherever you go. And Tyler, I think this plays into what you were just saying. It's not a bad thing to be afraid when it's the appropriate time to be afraid. The question sometimes, are we fearful of the wrong thing, or not realizing, to what you just said, the trust factor, the power of our God? And that sometimes is the struggle that we can have. Maybe you think about David and Goliath as an example, or Jesus, obviously. There's just the idea that, yes, there are things that you're going to face in life that are supposed to make you feel fearful, but it's not one of those things is your relationship with God if you're striving to do what He says because of who He is and the power that He has.
It's always that comparison of power, I think, that we struggle with the fear. We look at something and there's a sense of lack of power in the face of something else, or that I'm powerless to handle things. And a lot of times that's true. Understanding that the God of immense power, of all power, is on our side and working for our benefit and our good is what motivates us to take that fear and put it back into God's hands. When we talk about what we might call the opposite of fear, courage or bravery, it's not necessarily the absence of fear. I completely feel nothing when it comes to, starting this new venture or making a hard decision or having the tough conversation. You're going to be fearful of those things. Courage is stepping forward, in our case as believers in Christ, stepping forward in faith despite that fear. And so it doesn't mean that you have to be completely, I feel nothing and I'm completely brave. And it's a matter of trusting God in those things and recognizing his power over every situation that we might be facing. And so it's important to realize that God has given us that spirit of power. He's given us that assurance that he's with us, just like Joshua. Don't be dismayed as you go into Jericho. And then you go into this idea that he's given us this spirit of love. And obviously we can spend the rest of the program as we record it talking about the power of love and how love can cancel out fear. The scripture that comes to mind is in 1 John chapter 4. It's in verse 18, but I'll start in 16 just so we have a little bit of context. So we have come to know that to believe the love that God has for us. God is love, and whoever abides in love abides in God, and God abides in him. By this is love perfected with us, so that we may have confidence for the day of judgment, because as he is, so also are we in this world. There is no fear in love, but perfect love casts out fear. For fear has to do with punishment, and whoever fears has not been perfected in love. We love because he first loved us. And so obviously verse 18 here, Scott, is the piece that talks about the fear that obviously when you talk about things like this day of judgment and the accountability to God and am I abiding in him, that can bring about some fear, questioning, but this isn't the same fear that we'll talk about that leads us to obey the gospel, that holy reverence and understanding that there's this purpose for fear, right? That fear can be a big motivator in running to the Lord in the face of the strength or the devastation of my own sin and the consequences for that. But to realize that I don't have to stay in that state of fear. God doesn't want me to stay in that state of fear. There's no fear in love, John is writing, inspired by God. But perfect love is casting that fear aside. And it's, as he explains here, because it's not a matter of punishment. We have confidence, he talks about, to face that day of judgment. And it's God's work perfecting love in us. So this understanding that I don't have to, hem and haw and twiddle my thumbs worrying, maybe I'm going to get to heaven, maybe not. Look, if you're striving to abide in God and if you're striving to do the things that God has revealed by his word and you're genuinely pursuing greater and greater faith and knowledge through his word, you have all the confidence in the world. You can have all the confidence in the world. But too often we let that fear take over and instead we miss out on this immense love that's fueling the grace and the compassion and all of the many spiritual blessings we have through Christ. And I believe that's why John here is saying this perfect love is casting out fear.
And I think that's so powerful for us to really see that this is about a growth relationship with God. In the beginning, when I obeyed the gospel because I didn't want to go to hell. There was a fear of going to hell. And what happens is that you continue to grow as God's children, and then you understand that he wants you to be with him and loves you more than anybody else in this world. And that's the reality of the relationship with God. The problem sometimes, Tyler, is that we don't view it that way. And that's the danger. We view God as something to be afraid of and something to fear rather than allowing it to the reverence to become or to continue on and to love. That doesn't mean it stops. You continue to have reverence for him, for who he is. But it also makes us understand that he loves us and he wants us to be with him. The other part of this that's interesting is the self-control piece of this. And Psalm 56, as an example, in verse 3 says, "When I am afraid, I will put my trust in you. In God, whose word I praise, in God I have put my trust. I shall not be afraid. What can mere man do to me?" Tyler, this is obviously repeated in the New Testament, but it's amazing to think about the simplicity of this verse and then the complexity of actually living it out. And I think that's the interesting part to me. When I'm afraid, you're going to be afraid. That's okay. Where am I going to put my trust? Mm-hmm. That's that next step part that's so difficult for people, but it's my choice where I'm going to do that. And do I really believe that if I put my trust in God, I don't need to be afraid, because what can man do to me? It's understanding who he is and the power that he has. The scary part or the sad part is that we can struggle with that. We can talk about God being the great God and he's the all-powerful, all those things that he truly is. But when it comes down to trusting him and really doing those things, we struggle choosing to not be afraid or to continue in the fear that it causes us to pull away from God or pull away from the things that we need to be doing. And that's the struggle. But it's a choice that we all have to make sure that we are growing and continuing to work on that relationship.
And that's something we'll see with all of these emotions that we go through in the next few episodes, that we need to manage them. If we just give full vent to our feelings as we experience them, one of the Proverbs says, "A fool gives full vent to his anger," and that's a emotion that we'll talk about in a few episodes. But if we give full vent to anything, a full vent to our fear, full vent to our sadness, or happiness for that matter, it's an understanding of, if we're just feeling to feel and my feelings are my reality, then that's not what we're designed to do. The feelings are meant to inform us of our surroundings, of certainly physical surroundings, but also our spiritual nature and our spiritual condition. And so it's meant for us to manage and to act on them. So when we talk about fear, just as we wrap up here, I think it's really important to understand this aspect. And you'll hear lots of things about, fearing the Lord your God. There's lots of commandments to fear God just as much as there's commands to fear not. And so how does that work when we talk about managing this feeling of fear in a healthy, reverential sort of way toward God, but also not letting it hinder us in doing the things that he's called us to do, even when they're difficult or intimidating? I like to go to Luke 12 for this. There's other places in the Gospels of when Jesus says this, but Luke 12 just kind of summarizes it very nicely, I think, in verses 4 through 7. He talks about fear twice in these verses, but I want you to pay attention here how he says it both times. Jesus talking here. "I tell you, my friends, do not fear those who kill the body and after that have nothing more that they can do. But I will warn you whom to fear. Fear him who, after he has killed, has authority to cast into hell. Yes, I tell you, fear him. Are not 5 sparrows sold for 2 pennies? And not one of them is forgotten before God, while even the hairs of your head are all numbered. Fear not, you are of more value than many sparrows." I just love that Jesus, as he's teaching here, tells us to fear and fear not almost within one verse of each other. And so that you can maybe genuinely ask, well, am I supposed to fear God, or am I supposed to not fear? What's the point? And the idea is you need to respect God's power. He has all authority. He does have this immense holiness that we are not qualified to approach on our own. The fact is, Jesus came so that we could be in a right relationship with this holy God. And he says, you don't need to fear man. And yes, they have the power, to what we talked about earlier, to kill the body, but they can't do anything else than that. God has truly all power. But then Jesus goes into this understanding. This is the power God has. Now I want you to see the heart that God has. He cares about the birds. He knows these cheap birds that you buy for, 2 pennies that you can rub together, and you can buy a couple of them. He says there's not one that falls to the ground and God doesn't know about it. And so even your hairs are numbered. You think God doesn't care about you? Fear not. So you respect and have this healthy understanding of what your fear is supposed to lead you to do and how to act. But never forget that you are of more value than many sparrows. And I just love the way that Jesus puts that very simply, that we can fear not. We can put aside that fear because God hasn't given us that spirit of fear, but he's given us in Jesus Christ a spirit of power and of love and of self-control. And it's all because that you are from God. Thanks for listening. Show your support by leaving a review on your podcast app. And share this episode with someone you want to encourage. If you have questions or would like to get in touch with us, go to youarefromgod.com. That's youarefromgod.com.